for the opportunity we have to be here today. We thank Thee for the Sabbath. We ask, dear Lord, that You send Your Holy Spirit down amongst us. We ask, Lord, that my words be Your words, and that the message that You want me to give is Your message. We ask this in Your Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. Now, the interesting thing for me is I prepare my sermon, which has changed over the weeks, from being one sermon about family, because it was going to be done last quarter, to another sermon about prophecy, because that's the theme for this week. The song that we had sung today and the hymns that were sung by the praise team all are fitting in with my sermon today, which is entitled Joseph, but we could have called it Jesus, because Jesus is in the background of all of well, certainly my sermon. It's a sermon about overcoming hardship. It's a sermon about prophecy, but the prophecy is, if you like, not past prophecy, because Jeremiah 29:11, I have plans for you, is a prophecy for us. And as a young man growing up, even as a young child, my actually biggest memory that I've got is that we lived in a basement flat in London, and I was about, I suppose, 3 years old, and throughout my life I've been doing this. I escaped. And I was confronted on the stairs going up to the pavement by a big black rat, the size of a cat. And that is my endearing memory of living in a basement in London. Throughout my life, we've been overcoming hardship. Things are often of my own making. And God has been there before I knew God. And so I know that God has got plans for me. And I've told many people, when I was a young and foolish 19-year-old that joined the police force, my plan was that I wanted to be a superintendent, at least. Never made it. Got to the acting part, acting superintendent, but didn't make it because God had another plan for me. I think, because I don't know, we don't really know what God's plan is for us. We have to turn to God and ask Him to take us through it. I think that God's plan for me was actually to be Sarah's dad, because that seems to fit with what has gone on. And all I'm saying that is, you'll go through hardships, and we all will go through hardships, but God has a plan for you, and the prophecy to be fulfilled just requires you to turn to God, to turn to Jesus, and that plan will then begin to unfold. So it's a sermon about hope and answered prayer. It's a sermon about a grateful heart, because all that we have is owned by God. So the fact that I have a big house is a gift. The fact that we're able to go away and visit a country I'd never heard of, New Zealand, it does exist. But as a young person, I didn't know that. We didn't study big maps, we just studied small maps. And the fact that we can go there is not because we're rich, it's because God has gifted us with the opportunity and the means to carry out this activity. And so we go to New Zealand to spend time, but we know we go there knowing that God has got work for us to do whilst we're out there. I think Sarah's already got me a preaching appointment. But this is what God wants. And this is what God will have. I've got a reading that in some way talks about the grateful heart, and it's like a building block for us. In his book, Daring to Draw Near, Dr. John White writes this, that several years earlier, God made it possible for him to acquire a lovely home with many luxuries. His feelings about his home fluctuated dramatically. When he reminded himself that it was a gracious gift from God, he felt joy and thanksgiving. But when he began to compare his house with those of his friends, he began to feel proud. And because he had such a fine house, his joy would evaporate, because he felt pride instead of joy, because God had gifted it to him. His home became a burden. All he could see was how many hedges, how many lawns that needed cutting, all the jobs that had to be done. While vanity clouds my eyes and burden my heart, gratitude to God for the gifts clears my vision and lightens my load. Ecclesiastes saw God in every turn, in the enjoyment of material things, the power to eat the fruits of our labours, the power to enjoy the fruits of our labours, and even the strength to receive and rejoice in them comes from God. From beginning to end, all of life is just a continuous gift giving by God. We deserve nothing. He owes us nothing, yet he gives us everything. If we remember this, we need not feel selfish or guilty for what we have. Whatever material blessings we have are a gift from God. And so we ask that we be blessed for our gifts and that we use them for his purposes. Joseph was a prophet. From childhood, he had dreams that foretold the future. And the fact that he was able to interpret dreams of others that foretold the future. I know I have plans for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, plans to give you a future and a hope. It is as prophetic as you want it to be. When Jeremiah uses the word hope, it's not our understanding of the word hope in modern day English, which is, I hope it will happen. It's a maybe it will, maybe it won't. No, the hope that Jeremiah talks about and the hope that we have is a certainty if we believe what we read in the Bible. The hope we have is the blessed assurance that Jesus is coming again. The message in the word hope in the Bible, whenever you see it, is God sent his Son, Jesus, to earth to die for us. Jesus is now, at this very moment in time, preparing a place for us. And finally, the hope means Jesus will come again and he will take us back to heaven with him. I've told you something of my life, overcoming perhaps minor but many hardships. This week has been, the last 2 weeks has been terrible. Why do we need a new boiler 2 weeks before we go away? Why does one radiator that controls the thermostat still not work? All of these things are minor hardships to what's going on for individuals in the Philippines. And so these hardships that we face are there for each and every one of us. The McCluskey family have been through more heartache this year than many will face in a lifetime. Dan McCluskey is a police officer in Wyoming. He's got 21 years service, and he would tell you that in his 21 years of service, he has seen all of the disaster, the death, and the inhumanity that humanity can put on other people. I've seen a lot at work, and I've had to put together the pieces of people's broken lives, says Dan. But nothing prepared him for this last year. It's the worst year that I've ever had. Dan and his wife Megan are the proud parents of 14-year-old Aidan, who is a student at the local high school. When Aidan was 5 weeks old, and it happened suddenly, a medical emergency, they describe it as his bowels twisted off completely. He went into shock, he had a heart attack, and as a result of the prolonged shock, his kidneys shut down and failed. And doctors thought that Aidan's kidneys would perhaps repair themselves, but they didn't. And so, for the last 14 years, his kidney function has been, if he's lucky, 50%, and if he's unlucky, it's been down as low as 15%. They prepared them for when Aidan went into puberty, around the age of 16, telling him that he would either grow out of his kidneys and need a kidney transplant, or his kidneys would fail and he'd need a kidney transplant. A kidney transplant was planned for this last summer. Megan was getting ready to be the donor. And in April, life for the McCluskey family got worse. Megan was driving herself to her first appointment for preparation to be a donor. She said, "I knew that my life was going to change." What she didn't know was how her life was going to change. She was diagnosed at that meeting with stage 3 breast cancer, and it had spread to her lymph nodes. Even now, she says, it's hard, and it really hasn't sunk in. Dan says that he was in shock and horror and disbelief. Megan had life-threatening cancer, and he knew what they'd had planned for Aidan could now not go ahead. He was concerned about Megan's health, but he was worried about Aidan. He felt totally overwhelmed. As Megan began the fight for her life, she realised that she was no longer able to give the gift of life to her son. And she says, that I could not be a donor was the saddest part of the whole business. She immediately began chemotherapy treatments, and she faced the cancer head on, and Aidan's transplant was put on hold. Dan says, "I didn't think it could get any worse, but I was proved wrong. It could get worse, and it did." This family's strength was tested yet again on July the 29th this year. It was the last day of Megan's second round of cancer treatment. Dan describes, "We'd got home that afternoon, we'd just eaten dinner, Megan was lying on the couch resting, and Aidan was downstairs reading. Suddenly, he came running upstairs, shouting, 'The top of the house is on fire.' Within minutes, everything that they owned and worked for had gone up in smoke." Megan tells us, "After the chemotherapy, I knew that in a couple of days I was going to be really sick from the treatment. And now I have no place to live and only the clothes that I stand up in." It was hopeless to stand there and watch our home and our belongings go up in smoke, Dan tells us. But there's one thing that the fire couldn't take away from them. When everything is taken from you, material things, you realise that you don't need it. Megan says, what you really need is each other. And we had that. Now, for Dan, the man who's dedicated his life to helping others, the tables have been turned. Others are going to have to help him. Megan describes how everywhere they went, people would come up and give them something. All the time, we were told that people were praying for us and giving us words of encouragement. Life will never be the same for the McCluskey family, but having the support of family, the community, friends, and even strangers from across the world, they know that they'll be able to overcome whatever comes their way. Dan says that one of the first things I told Megan when she realised she had cancer, I gave her a hug and said, it's going to be okay. We're going to get through this. And that's how we've dealt with it as we've gone through. Megan had surgery a few weeks ago, and the doctors think they've removed all the cancer, but she'll obviously continue the treatments. Aidan's transplant is now planned for next summer, and the donor is Dan. They are planning to rebuild their home on the same plot in the spring. Your prayers are asked for the McCluskey family. They saw, as they went through their problems, the other side of the page. They could see the bright side. They were optimists. They had hope in the midst of despair. The story doesn't tell us whether Dan and the family are Christians or not, but I have a sense that he is like what I found. God has a plan for that family, and the plan is working its way through. And through the activities of others, they will come to know God. It's better to understand people's views of optimists and pessimists. A researcher placed two children, one a pessimist and one an optimist, into two separate rooms. The pessimist was placed in a colourful room with lots of imaginative toys. The optimist was put in a room filled with horse manure. The first child came to the door and said, I want to leave. The toys are boring and they break easily. The optimist came to the door and asked for a shovel. Yes, why do you want a shovel? Well, with all this manure, there must be a pony in here somewhere. Optimists always see the bright side. They always see what's good and not what's bad. And remember, we as Christians are more than optimists because we have the blessed assurance of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a highly respected prophet, and the Bible finds no fault for him. And in his early life, it was a story of difficulty and hardship. He was the youngest son of Jacob, and he had 10 stepbrothers. I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, which is relevant later on. His stepbrothers hated him and sold him as a slave to travelling nomads. He was brought as a slave by Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard, and taken to Egypt. Joseph believed that God had a plan for him. Joseph believed that God was working his plan through him. He was prospering, working in that household. But then he was falsely accused and thrown into prison. but God had a plan, and Joseph believed that God had a plan, and he continued to pray and communicate with God. In prison, he worked hard. He worked so hard that the people in charge of the prison put him in charge of the prisoners. Whilst in prison, he correctly interpreted 2 prisoners' dreams. He later correctly interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. He was released from prison and granted high office. It was Joseph who predicted the 7 years of famine, and it was he who created the plan that was to make Egypt a safe haven in a region of famine, so that people travelled from far and near to get food and supplies from the storehouses that had been prepared in Egypt. Joseph was a well-respected member of the Egyptian society. He rose in rank so that only the Pharaoh was above him. He was the equivalent of the Prime Minister of what was one of the most important capitals and countries in the world at that time. Joseph never doubted that God had plans for him, plans not to harm him, and plans to give him a future. And when you read through Genesis 39 through to 45, it's the story of Joseph, and it tells that the Bible found no fault in him. It talks of his integrity, his kindness, his humility. It talks of his wisdom, his piety, and it talks of his faith. But the story of Joseph's early life is a description of family life within an extremely dysfunctional family. Joseph's family, and I would say Joseph himself, was dysfunctional. It was a family that was disintegrating from the inside as a result of the hurt that was going on within it. From a Christian perspective, a dysfunctional family is a family that is not functioning as God intended. It may be as a result of a lack of communication, divorce, child rivalry, selfish parents, addictions, abuse, violence. All of these things, the list can go on, can create a dysfunctional family. We learn our personal parenting and marriage skills within the marriage of our parents. Therefore, we learn our good or our bad parenting, good and a bad marriage skills from the behaviour of our parents. Children often repeat as they grow up the same mistakes as their parents or grandparents. The end result is that dysfunctional families can create dysfunctional families, often for generations. I think this is what the Bible is telling us in Numbers 14:18, which says, God visits the iniquity of the families on the children to the 3rd and 4th generations. Living in such a dysfunctional family can be difficult to live for God, but not impossible, because Joseph is proof that it can be done. He came from a dysfunctional family, but he didn't repeat the errors of his dysfunctional parents and brothers. He lived in a home that was filled with anger, jealousy, and deceit. It was a recipe for disaster. Joseph had imperfect parents, imperfect brothers, and he himself was imperfect. His family was unbelievable, even by today's standards. He had 3 stepmothers, 10 stepbrothers, and a stepsister, all living in the same house, tent, at the same time. Imagine the turmoil in that family, and then add to it other details. Jacob, a man of the Bible, but he had many wives. He was a passive parent, and he showed favoritism amongst his children. And Jacob's wives were jealous of each other and insecure. His home, for Joseph, had 4 unhappy women in it. Now, I don't live in a house with 1 unhappy woman, but to live in a house with 4. We should be thankful that we live in a house with 1. Sometimes a daughter arrives and so there's 2, and you lose your vote there. But basically, our families, God willing, look after each other. But Charles Swindoll, who wrote of Joseph, a man of integrity and forgiveness, he says Jacob was a classic illustration of a man who was too busy for his family, too preoccupied and unconcerned, too passive to deal with what was going on in the lives of any of his children. Jacob's passiveness as a parent contributed to the turmoil in that family. Jacob's daughter had been raped by the son of the local mayor, and you can read about it in Genesis 34. But Jacob did nothing. In Genesis 34:29 we read that the sons took revenge. They murdered and killed all the men in that town. But Jacob did nothing. In Genesis 35:21 we read that Reuben, his eldest son, had an affair with Bilhah, Jacob's concubine. But Jacob did nothing. Joseph was a terrible brother. So was I. Despite being chosen by God at a very young age, Joseph had the flaws, which I think are flaws of youth. And we as adults may reflect on our lives and recognise some of these flaws. I as a teenager or young man wouldn't have seen any of these flaws, but my brothers and sisters did. Joseph was faithful to God in an imperfect family. He was not faultless as a child. But he learnt from his errors. So there is a chance for us. We all will make errors growing up. We all will make errors in our work life, in our home life. Some of them catastrophic errors. But we can turn to God and ask Him to tell us what is His plan for us, and ask Him to solve the problems that are currently facing us. Joseph was the youngest son, and he was most favoured and most spoilt. I was the middle child. I wasn't most favoured. I certainly... Yes, my mum loved me more than the others because I got away with more. But I was the worst child in terms of behaviour. You know, my brothers and sisters will tell you that there's a door at home, or there was a door at home, that got kicked in because I had an anger rage and kicked the door in anger and frustration. And then my father came home and explained to me why you don't do things. Sorry. It's Anna, but we'll talk to her later. Joseph was the youngest son. He was most favoured and most spoilt. As a child, he did not help the situation. He lived and worked with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. Joseph was a telltale. He told tales to his father about his brothers. He wasn't lying, he was always truthful. But sometimes, some of these messages didn't need to be told. And the brothers didn't like him and began to hate him because of these tales he told the father. Jacob loved Joseph more than his older brothers, and he demonstrated this favoritism in a dramatic way. He made him a coat of many colours. Not just any old coat. The Hebrew word used to describe this coat is that it is a robe extending from wrist to ankles. It was a robe as worn by nobility and the wealthy. Whereas his brothers, their clothes were work clothes. They were short and sleeveless. They needed to be because they had to clamber up hills, wade through swampy areas, carry sheep on their shoulders. Joseph's coat declared that he was exempt from manual labour and hardship, and it represented Joseph's favoured position. His coat showed that he was the rightful heir in the family. Middle Eastern custom has it that if the eldest son, which was Reuben, lost the birthright, then it went to the eldest son of the second wife. Reuben lost his birthright because of the incest with his father's concubine. The birthright fell to Joseph, and the coat stated this to the world. His brothers hated him, Jacob favoured him. His dreams rubbed salt in the wound. They envied him his coat and his position of privilege. They envied him the father's affection. They envied him that even God seemed to have a special place in sending him dreams that he could receive and talk about. These things heightened their envy and their hatred. Joseph as a child was imperfect. He was perhaps a normal 17-year-old. He was naive to the world at that age, but thought he knew it. He was a little bit arrogant in his behaviour. He was just a little bit proud in how he wore his special coat out into the fields to check on his brothers. He wore the coat as a badge of authority and rank that he had not earned. In hindsight, it would be easy for us to understand how Joseph's behaviour fanned the flames of the brothers' hatred towards him. We cannot blame ourselves for the faults of others, but we can take responsibility for our own faults. A bricklayer took his lunch out and exclaimed, "Oh no, not cheese sandwiches again. I'm absolutely sick and tired of cheese sandwiches. If I see another cheese sandwich, I think I'll just die." A co-worker said, "Why don't you ask your wife to pack you something different?" He replied, "I'm not married. I pack my own lunchbox." That story is just to let us know that some of the cheese in our lives, some of the stuff we don't like, we put there ourselves and we don't change it. We forget God's message in Jeremiah 29:11. God has plans for each of us, plans not to harm us, plans to give us a future and a hope. No one knows what tomorrow holds for any of us. We know, and God knows, all about tomorrows. We know that God knows all about our tomorrows. And for Christians, that should be enough. I know I have plans for you. Plans for welfare, not for evil. Plans to give you a future and a hope. God is in control of our lives and our destiny if we let him. God has a purpose for each of us, for everything that happens to us. If we have any problems, God can solve them. We just need to find the Jesus solution, and then God's plan will become our plan and will be fulfilled in his way, in his time. Thank you.
Amen.